This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 411 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I'm not someone who thinks, oh, it's just week one, it doesn't really matter, especially during a season where we had no preseason. This was the first professional football that we've seen since February. I'd argue that underreacting can be more damaging than overreacting, at least at this very moment. But listen, guys, it's my job to not do either of those things. I shouldn't overreact and I shouldn't underreact. I should be logical and help guide you guys to making the right fantasy football decisions. I need to react. That's part of my job. But I need to react in a rational way. And that's what I try to do each and every week, but especially early on in the season. So keep that in mind as you listen to today's show. If there's a point where you say, oh, JJ's just taking this way too far, then I would love to hear about it. I want to get better. And I want to make sure that I'm being rational. Because some really interesting stuff happened in week one. And I want to make sure that we're all on the same page moving forward. And that my weekly brain vomit makes sense. Now, before getting into this week's brain vomit or this week's 15 transactions, I wanted to let you guys know about the Ringers Mega Contest. It's easy. You just make 5 picks against the spread, including 1 double down every week. The top 100 users at the end of the season will compete for $25,000 in prizes during the playoffs. And the best part? It's free to enter. Week 1 is already done, so what are you waiting for? To enter for free, visit playfree.fanduel.com/theringer. That's playfree.fanduel.com/theringer. Eligibility restrictions apply. Hold Austin Ekeler. So I sent a tweet during the Bengals-Chargers game saying that Austin Ekeler's fantasy stock was dropping. Honestly, it's hard to sell Ekeler's week 1 outing as a positive. Now, it's great that he carried the ball 19 times. That was actually a career high. But the problem is he only saw 1 target. And targets are about twice as valuable as rushes in half PPR formats. This is concerning because this was the first game that Austin Ekeler played without Phillip Rivers. And as we saw on Sunday, Phillip Rivers is a quarterback who likes to target his running backs. Indianapolis running backs on Sunday had 17 of 36 completions. Phillip Rivers clearly likes throwing the ball to that position. And because of that, and I talked about this on the show all offseason, we knew that Ekeler's numbers were going to regress in some way as a receiver. Not just because of natural regression, but because Phillip Rivers was no longer going to be his quarterback. But Ekeler scored 1/3 of LA's receiving touchdowns last year. He had a 9.2 yards per target rate. That was the second highest that we've seen from any 50-plus target back since 2011. Austin Ekeler was not going to repeat what he did in 2019 through the air here in 2020. It was not going to happen. And maybe this week 1 game isn't that big of a deal. Maybe this 1 target game is going to end up being an outlier. That's very possible, and that's why I don't think that we should just sit here and say that Austin Ekeler is doomed. But it's really hard to ignore that this was the first game that Ekeler played without Phillip Rivers, and he had 1 target. Now, of course, if he's not going to see as much volume through the air, that means if he sees more volume on the ground, he can maybe make up for that. And that's what he did. He had 19 rushes. That was a career high. He saw 57.6% of the team's running back rushes, which was a number that he only hit when Melvin Gordon was sidelined last year, when he didn't play. The problem here, though, is that Austin Ekeler didn't look like the goal line back in this game. Rookie Joshua Kelly did. And Joshua Kelly is the bigger-bodied guy between those players. This was my fear all offseason. Maybe fear is not the right word because I like Josh Kelly, but this is what I was worried about with Austin Ekeler. LA ran it twice at the goal line against Cincinnati. Joshua Kelly had both of those carries. So what does this all mean? It means that Austin Ekeler saw a lot of rush attempts in a run-heavy Chargers offense on Sunday. That's not a bad thing. I'm not sitting here saying that Austin Ekeler is going to be worthless in fantasy football. What's concerning is that he only had 1 target. He had a 3% target share. And his offense couldn't do much against a beatable Cincinnati defense. And then on top of that, he's not seeing goal line work, or he didn't see goal line work here in week 1. Since 2011, of the 90 running backs to finish in the top 10 at the position in fantasy football, 80% of them finished with more than 50 targets. And over 92% of them had 7 or more touchdowns. Now, this isn't to say that Ekeler won't hit 50 targets. It's that he absolutely needs all this to change moving forward. This cannot continue. There is no chance that he's going to live up to his preseason average draft position if his target share stays under 10%. It was 19% last year. And then on top of that, he's not seeing goal line work. Now, the reason that Austin Ekeler is a hold and not a sell right now is because I do think that his stock is going to rise over the next 2 weeks because they get the Chiefs and then the Panthers. We watched David Johnson exploit that Chiefs defense. David Johnson looked great in that game. And that's something that's a continuation from last year. And then the Panthers, they might have the worst defense in football this year. We saw what Josh Jacobs was able to do to them in week 1. So I'm not saying that you have to overreact and get rid of Austin Ekeler. I'm just saying that it's very, very important to recognize these types of concerns. And we can't just brush them off because it's just week 1. Add Joshua Kelly. So I think it seems logical to follow up all that Ekeler talk with adding Joshua Kelly. He made this podcast last week. I talked about Kelly being an ad on last week's show. And then he ended up carrying the ball 12 times for 60 yards and a touchdown against Cincinnati. That was the first game of his career. He might be able to carve out an even bigger role in this offense. He had a 36.4% running back rush share. That's not hateful. And he had both goal line rushes like I just mentioned. It was a good start for Joshua Kelly's career. Buy DJ Moore. Look, it was a bad outing or a disappointing outing for DJ Moore in week 1. It was a good matchup for him, and he only had 4 catches for 54 yards. But his usage was actually pretty good. He had 9 targets, and that translated to a 26.4% target share. That was the highest on the team. And he also had 3 targets that traveled 15 or more air yards. Like I just said earlier, the Panthers' defense shouldn't be very good this season. And that was sort of confirmed in week 1 as they allowed 34 points to the Raiders. So what that means is there could be a lot of negative game scripts for this Panthers team. And if that's the case, if DJ Moore is able to maintain this target share in any way, shape, or form, he should see a lot of volume. Add Robbie Anderson. So Robbie Anderson was a nice surprise in week 1 too. He finished his day second on the team in wide receiver snap share ahead of Curtis Samuel, and he only had 1 fewer target than DJ Moore. And then he had that big 75-yard touchdown. I already talked about it with DJ Moore, but Teddy Bridgewater overall, he actually threw it deep at one of the higher rates in the league in week 1. 9 of his 34 attempts went 15 or more air yards. And we've seen Robbie Anderson as this deep ball, big play specialist in the past. It all fits together. So using that same logic of negative game scripts with DJ Moore, volume could be there in this offense and for Robbie Anderson. I think he has wide receiver 3 upside this year. Sell Devin Singletary. Now look, last week I talked about buying Zach Moss, so it kind of makes sense that I would be selling Devin Singletary. And we got a lot of information in week 1 from this Bills backfield. It was completely split. Both running backs saw half of the running back rushes. Now Josh Allen carried the ball a whole lot too, but this backfield was completely split in half. Singletary did see 7 targets. That's awesome. But you can also use that when you're negotiating a trade. My issue has always been, and it continues to be, Devin Singletary at the goal line. And that's where this information comes into play. In week 1, we saw Zach Moss be that player. He had all 3 running back attempts from within the 5-yard line on Sunday. So I do think Singletary has a chance to maybe maintain RB2 status in PPR formats. But I have no idea where that ceiling is going to come from without a Zach Moss injury. Add Nyheim Hines and buy Jonathan Taylor. So the biggest fantasy football injury from week 1 was Marlon Mack going down with his torn Achilles. And that opens things up a lot for Nyheim Hines and Jonathan Taylor. Let's start with Nyheim Hines. Remember earlier when I talked about Phillip Rivers targeting his running backs out of the backfield? Well, Hines benefited from that a lot in week 1. He had 8 targets, a 17.4% target share, and he carried the ball 4 times and had a pair of targets in the red zone. That allowed him and helped him score twice. So Nyheim Hines should be a priority off the waiver wire this week. But then there's Jonathan Taylor. This is setting up for Jonathan Taylor to be a league-winning running back this year. At the very least, he's going to see the majority of early down work for this Indianapolis offense. Once Marlon Mack went down, Taylor out-attempted Hines 10-3. And he actually saw 6 targets to Nyheim Hines' 7 targets. As a lot of you know if you listen to this podcast over the offseason, I'm a big Jonathan Taylor guy. He had amazing college production, and then he has great athleticism too. Now that Mack is not in his way workload-wise, Jonathan Taylor is going to go nuts in fantasy football. You should be valuing Taylor as a low-end RB1 right now. And I'm not entirely sure the rest of the market is valuing him that way. Sometimes in fantasy football, you have to buy high. Add Benny Snell. So unfortunately, in the Monday night game between the Steelers and the Giants, James Conner had an ankle injury. Prior to that injury, he had carried the ball 6 times for 9 yards, nice, and a 0% success rate. He was not all that effective. And then Benny Snell stepped in. Snell looked a lot quicker and better than he did last year, which was his rookie season. He carried the ball 19 times for 113 yards, and he had a 37% success rate. So if James Conner misses some time, Benny Snell could very, very easily be fantasy relevant. Hold Hayden Hurst and add Russell Gage. So the Falcons offense, they were very pass heavy once again here in week 1. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that they were forced into a negative game script against the Seahawks. But somehow Hayden Hurst still finished with just 3 catches for 38 yards. He had only a 9.6% target share. And meanwhile, Calvin Ridley, Julio Jones, and Russell Gage, they all had a 23.1% target share, each and every one of them. That's the main reason that you would be adding Russell Gage this week. Now, despite this, I would not be giving up on Hayden Hurst because he still led all tight ends in routes run in week 1, according to Pro Football Focus. He was still on the field for about 79% of Atlanta's snaps. I do think that what we might see in what week 1 showed us is that there might be some frustration week in and week out between Russell Gage and Hayden Hurst depending on matchup, while Calvin Ridley and Julio Jones just eat. But I would not be giving up on Hayden Hurst just yet. Add Malcolm Brown. So last week on this show, I talked about Malcolm Brown as the 16th transaction, and then I talked him up as well on the matchup show. Because Darrell Henderson was banged up, and we didn't know what we were going to get from rookie Cam Akers. And let me tell you something. Malcolm Brown was the best running back in that Rams backfield in week 1. And I don't think it was really close. And neither do metrics. Number Fire's expected points model looks at success rate, which is the percentage of positive expected points runs made by a running back. Malcolm Brown's success rate was 66.7%. Cam Akers was 14.3%. And then all the while, Malcolm Brown had 18 attempts and 4 targets. Cam Akers had 14 attempts and 1 target. And Brown played 60.3% of the Rams snaps. Cam Akers has a tough climb to take over this backfield. That is, if Malcolm Brown can keep this up. So I would absolutely be adding Malcolm Brown off the waiver wire this week. Buy Antonio Gibson. Okay, so look, it wasn't the best debut in the world for Antonio Gibson. But this also makes for a good buy low opportunity. The Washington backfield was completely split in week 1. We had Peyton Barber leading the way with almost 59% of the team's running back rushes, and he actually had a league-high 6 goal line carries. But then on top of that, Antonio Gibson wasn't utilized that heavily as a receiver. J.D. McKissick was the primary pass-catching back in that offense. He had over 16% of the team's targets. Gibson's target share was just 6%. But here's the good news, you guys. Neither running back, neither Peyton Barber or J.D. McKissick, were very effective. Barber had a success rate of 23.5%, and McKissick caught just 1 of his 5 targets. Antonio Gibson caught both of his targets. So just be patient. We know that Gibson is a raw talent. He played wide receiver in college. But there's plenty of potential for him to ascend in this backfield. Add Paris Campbell. I thought one of the most encouraging games from Sunday came from Paris Campbell. He had an injury-filled, mediocre rookie season, but he came out and he saw almost 20% of Indianapolis's targets on Sunday. He caught 6 of 9 of them, nice, for 71 yards. And according to Pro Football Focus, he played 95% of his snaps from the slot. So he's going to see some easy matchups throughout the season. I think he's going to be someone that gives you a nice baseline each week. And then he has big playability as well. So if he's on your waiver wire, I would definitely snatch him this week. Sell Raheem Mostert. So I wrote in my 15 transactions column that this is going to be the one transaction of the week that could easily come back to haunt me. But I can't ignore the things that were working in Raheem Mostert's favor in week 1. The 49ers pass catchers are not healthy. Deebo Samuel is on IR, so he's going to be out for the first 3 games of the season at least. And then Brandon Ayuk wasn't able to play on Sunday either. And then in that 49ers game, George Kittle got hurt. That perfect storm forced Jimmy Garoppolo to target the San Francisco backfield on 44% of his targeted attempts. They had a 44% target share. Raheem Mostert obviously benefited from that. He had a 15.6% target share when he hit a double-digit percentage target share just twice last year. And he was able to house one of those targets on a 76-yard touchdown. Now, Tevin Coleman was also iffy on playing this week because of his sickle cell trait and the poor air quality in California. So that may explain the lower than expected usage on Tevin Coleman's end. And that also helped Mostert capture a larger portion of the team's backfield. Now, overall, it's not that I'm not a believer in Raheem Mostert in fantasy football. I mean, I'm not compared to a lot of people, but I still think he's an RB2. He's fine. And he's good in this 49ers offense. And not only that, but they have some attractive matchups over the next month. But what I'm saying here is, if you can sell him as an RB1 to someone, if they're overreacting to this performance, I'm totally for it. Add Corey Davis. So the Titans were forced to throw a little bit more than usual on Monday night against Denver. But even still, Corey Davis had himself a day. He had 7 catches on 8 targets. He had 101 yards receiving. And most importantly, within the context of this offense, he had a 20% target share. He outproduced A.J. Brown. Now, is this going to continue? I'm not totally sure. At least we know that Corey Davis has some talent. And we are 1 year removed from seeing a similar breakout story in Devontae Parker. So sure, it's possible that Corey Davis puts it together this year. I do think the downside, though, is that Tennessee does want to be a balanced run-heavy team. Ryan Tannehill had 43 pass attempts on Monday night. He didn't hit that mark in a single regular season game last year. And that should limit opportunities within this offense. But I do think regardless of all of that, Corey Davis is worth an add this week. Add Logan Thomas. It's happening. Logan Thomas is happening. This was exactly what I needed to see in week 1. Logan Thomas is going to be used a lot in this Washington offense. He saw almost 26% of Washington's targets. He was a top 10 fantasy tight end, and he was top 10 across the league in tight end routes run as well. I've been talking about Thomas a lot on this podcast throughout the offseason, but he's happening. I think he can finish as a top 10 tight end this year. So add Logan Thomas. Add the Cleveland Browns defense. So the Browns are somehow rostered in 9% of Yahoo leagues, even though they played the Ravens in week 1. But regardless, they're not a bad streaming option in week 2 against Cincinnati. The Bengals allowed a top half of the league sack rate in week 1, with Joe Burrow getting sacked 3 times. The Browns didn't do a whole lot to contain Lamar Jackson on Sunday, but they did rank in the middle of the pack in pressure rate. So I think they could get to Joe Burrow in this game. They're 5.5-point favorites. There's a relatively low 44.5-point over-under. I think the Browns are a good streaming option. The 16th transaction that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com this week is to buy Henry Ruggs. The reason I didn't want to put this in my column is because there needs to be context. You need to hear my voice and how I'm talking about this to really understand what I mean by buying Henry Ruggs. Because here's the truth. The upcoming schedule for Las Vegas sucks for Henry Ruggs. He's going to face some really tough cornerback matchups. But despite that injury that he had against Carolina this past week, he still saw 5 targets, which is fine, but 3 of those targets came down the field. He ended the game with over 50% of the team's overall air yards. And I'm bullish on that. I'm bullish on the Raiders using Ruggs in that way. He's got big playability. And if there's someone who drafted him that doesn't want to hang on after what they saw in week 1, it's not a bad idea to trade for Henry Ruggs and stash him. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the 10 Trends episode.